Welcome to Bone to Be Friendly Orthopedics Chat, the podcast where you can sit back, relax, and listen to interesting bone and joint topics curated by an expert and delivered with an AI-powered realistic conversational format. Join us as we explore common questions and interesting topics in orthopedics.
Okay, so today we're going to deep dive into all things osteoporosis. We've got a ton of research lined up here, and we're going to try and bring you the most important takeaways as quickly and thoroughly as we can.
Yeah, that's right. We want to make sure you come away from this deep dive with a solid understanding of what osteoporosis is, what it means for you, and who really needs to be paying attention to it the most.
Exactly. So let's jump right in, osteoporosis. It's a condition that causes your bones to weaken and become more brittle over time.
Right. And this weakening, makes you a lot more susceptible to fractures.
Yeah. And I mean, just the term itself, osteoporosis, it literally translates to porous bone, which, when you think about it, really kind of paints a visual, right?
Yeah, it does, huh? And what's really interesting here is that our bones, they're not just these static structures. They're actually living tissue, constantly in this process of breaking down and rebuilding themselves.
So like remodeling.
Yeah, exactly. It's a continuous cycle, throughout our lives. And when we talk about osteoporosis, what we're really talking about is a disruption of that balance.
So the breakdown is happening faster than the rebuilding?
Exactly. That's when you start to see this loss of bone density, which is kind of at the core of what osteoporosis is.
I see. And, looking through the research here, the WHO, the World Health Organization, they've actually come up with a way to diagnose osteoporosis. And it's all based on this thing called bone mineral density, or BMD.
Right, BMD. And they use a special type of scan called a DXA scan to measure this.
Okay, so a DXA scan gives you your BMD, and then from there they use something called a T-score.
Right.
So basically the T-score compares your bone density to the bone density of a healthy young adult of the same sex.
Oh, okay.
And the way it works is if your T-score is at a NATIS 2.5 or lower at either your hip or your spine, that's when you meet the criteria for an osteoporosis diagnosis.
So lower than MIDIC to 2.5 osteoporosis.
You got it. Okay. And our sources also mention this thing called osteopenia.
Right. Osteopenia, it's kind of like a precursor to osteoporosis.
Oh, okay. So like a warning sign.
Exactly. So with osteopenia, your T-score is going to be between -1 and -2.5. So it's not quite at the osteoporosis level yet, but it does indicate that your bone density is lower than it should be for your age.
I see. So you're kind of on the path, potentially.
Yeah. And that's why this stage is so important, because it's a real opportunity to intervene.
To maybe prevent it from getting worse.
Exactly. You can make lifestyle changes. You might consider some preventative treatments and potentially slow down or even stop the progression to osteoporosis.
Okay, so we've got osteoporosis. We've got this kind of precursor osteopenia now. When we do have osteoporosis, which bones are the most likely to break?
Okay, so the research points to three main areas. The vertebrae in your spine, the proximal femur, which is that top part of your thigh bone near your hip, and the distal forearm, which is basically your wrist.
Okay, so spine, hip, wrist, those are the big ones.
Those are the ones that tend to fracture most often with osteoporosis.
And it makes sense, right? Because those are the areas that either bear a lot of weight or are involved in falls.
Exactly.
So, if your bones are already weak in those areas, it's a recipe for disaster.
It is. And here's the thing. Osteoporosis, it's often called a silent disease.
Silent disease. What does that mean?
Well, it means a lot of people don't even realize they have it until they actually break a bone.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, no symptoms, no warning signs, just suddenly a fracture.
So it's kind of sneaking up on you.
It can be.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to be aware of the risk factors and to be proactive.
Yeah.
Especially if you fall into one of those higher risk groups we talked about.
Yeah, and these fractures that we're talking about, the ones that happen because of osteoporosis, they're not like your typical broken bone.
Right. They're often referred to as fragility fractures.
Fragility fractures.
Yeah, because they can happen from forces that wouldn't normally break a healthy bone.
So like what kind of forces?
Well, a simple fall from standing height or, bending over the wrong way.
Really just bending over.
It can be enough. Yeah. Especially if the bones are weak.
And I imagine these fragility fractures, they must have a pretty big impact on people's lives.
They absolutely do. It's not just the pain of the fracture itself, but the lasting consequences.
Okay. So what kind of consequences?
If we're talking about chronic pain that just doesn't go away, disability that limits your ability to do everyday things, reduced mobility, having trouble getting around, loss of independence. You might not be able to care for yourself the way you used to. And overall, a significant decline in your quality of life.
Wow, that's heavy. And I've heard that hip fractures in particular, they're really dangerous for older adults.
Yeah, hip fractures are a major concern. They're associated with very high mortality rates, especially within the first year after the fracture.
Oh, wow.
And a lot of times they require long-term care in a nursing home, which, can really impact someone's independence and their overall well-being.
Then it's not just the hip fractures that are a problem, right? I mean, we talked about the spine as well.
Vertebral fractures, those are the ones that happen in the spine. They can also cause some serious issues.
So like what kind of issues are we talking about?
Well, chronic back pain, that's really debilitating. Loss of height, as the vertebrae compress, and that stooped posture that we often see in older people, that dowager's hump.
Right. And sometimes those vertebral fractures, they can happen without even a fall.
That's right.
Yeah.
The bones can be so weak that just everyday movements can be enough to cause a fracture.
And, on top of the individual suffering, there's also the economic impact to consider, right? I mean, treating osteoporosis and all its complications, it must cost a fortune.
It does. It puts a huge strain on healthcare systems around the world.
Yeah.
Between the cost of surgeries, medications, rehabilitation, long-term care, it all adds up.
And this is why prevention and early intervention, they're so crucial, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole.
Right. If we can catch it early and slow down the progression, we can potentially avoid a lot of those fractures and all the associated costs.
Okay, so let's talk about who's most at risk here. Who should really be paying attention to this information?
Well, the research consistently points to two main groups: postmenopausal women and men aged 50 and older.
So those are the groups that are statistically most likely to develop osteoporosis.
Exactly.
And why is it that women are more susceptible after menopause?
It really comes down to estrogen.
Estrogen.
Yeah, estrogen plays a key role in maintaining bone density. And when women go through menopause, their estrogen levels drop dramatically.
Oh, okay. So that rapid decline in estrogen, that's what triggers the bone loss.
It's a big factor. Yeah, the interesting thing is women who experience early menopause, before the age of 45, or who have their ovaries surgically removed at a younger age, they're at an even higher risk.
Oh, because they have a longer period of low estrogen?
Exactly. Their bones are exposed to that low estrogen environment for a much longer time.
Okay, so we've got menopause for women, and then for men and women, both age itself is a risk factor, right?
Absolutely. As we get older, our bone density naturally declines. It's just part of the aging process, unfortunately.
So regardless of your sex, the older you get, the weaker your bones tend to become.
That's the general trend.
Yeah.
But there are also differences between ethnicities.
Oh, really?
Yeah, research has shown that people of white or Asian descent tend to have a higher risk of osteoporosis compared to other racial groups.
Oh, okay. So ethnicity plays a role, and then there's family history as well, right?
That's another big one. If you have a parent or a sibling who's been diagnosed with osteoporosis, or especially if a parent has had a hip fracture, your own risk goes up.
Okay. And is that because of genetics?
It could be genetics,
Yeah.
but also, families tend to share similar lifestyles and habits, so that could play a role as well.
Right. So it's kind of a combination of nature and nurture.
Exactly. And then on top of those kind of baseline risk factors, we've got all these other things that can contribute to osteoporosis. Lifestyle choices, medical conditions, medications.
Okay, let's break those down one by one, starting with lifestyle. What are some of the things that people are doing that could be putting their bone health at risk?
Okay, well, first off, there's diet. Not getting enough calcium in your diet over the years. That's a big one. Calcium is essential for building strong bones.
Right, you can have the building blocks.
Exactly. And it's not just about calcium. You also need vitamin D.
Ah, yeah. Vitamin D helps your body absorb the calcium.
Exactly. So if you're deficient in vitamin D, you're not going to be able to utilize the calcium you're consuming effectively.
I see. And then there's exercise, or lack thereof, I should say.
Right. A sedentary lifestyle, not getting enough weight-bearing exercise, that's a major risk factor.
And weight-bearing exercise is what puts stress on your bones, which actually helps them stay strong.
Exactly. It's like muscles. If you don't use them, they weaken, and the same goes for bones.
Okay, so diet, exercise, those are the biggies, and then there's alcohol and smoking.
Yeah, those are definitely no-nos for bone health.
So how much alcohol is too much?
Well, our sources say that more than 1 drink per day for women and more than 2 drinks per day for men, that's when you start to see negative effects on bone density.
Okay, and smoking, I imagine any amount is bad.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Tobacco use in any form, whether it's cigarettes, cigars, vaping, it all damages your bones.
Got it. And then there are eating disorders.
Yeah, particularly anorexia nervosa.
Because you're not getting the nutrients you need.
Exactly. With anorexia, there's severe calorie restrictions, so you're not getting enough of the essential vitamins and minerals that your bones need to stay healthy.
Plus, there are hormonal imbalances that come with anorexia.
Right. It can really wreak havoc on your entire system.
Okay, so that's diet, exercise, alcohol, smoking, eating disorders. What else?
Well, falls are a big one, especially as we get older.
Because if you fall and your bones are weak, you're much more likely to break something.
Exactly. And then there's being underweight.
Underweight.
Yeah, having a low body mass index or BMI, that's been linked to lower bone density as well.
Okay. And our sources also mention a few other things like high salt intake, excessive vitamin A, and prolonged periods of immobilization.
Yeah, those can all potentially contribute to weaker bones.
And they even touch on things like caffeine and antacids.
Right, although the evidence for those might be a little less clear-cut.
Okay, so we've covered lifestyle. Let's move on to medical conditions. Now, are there certain medical conditions that increase your risk of osteoporosis?
There are quite a few, actually.
Yeah.
A lot of endocrine disorders like hyperthyroidism, hyperparathyroidism, Cushing's syndrome diabetes, they can all affect bone health.
Oh, right, because they mess with your hormones.
Exactly, and hormones play a big role in regulating bone density.
Got it. And then there are gastrointestinal disorders as well.
Yeah, things like celiac disease and inflammatory bowel disease, they can interfere with nutrient absorption.
So you might not be able to absorb enough calcium and vitamin D even if you're eating plenty of them.
Right, and then there's kidney disease, liver disease, certain types of cancer like multiple myeloma and autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis.
Okay, so quite a laundry list there. And then on top of all of this, we have medications.
Yeah, certain medications can have a negative impact on bone health.
So like what kind of medications?
Well, corticosteroids are a big one.
Right.
Prednisone is a common one. Some anti-seizure medications, certain types of acid blockers, anti-estrogen medications that are used to treat breast cancer, anticoagulants like heparin and aromatase inhibitors, also used for breast cancer.
Wow, that's a lot of medications, and a lot of people are taking those.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to talk to your doctor about all the medications you're on, especially if you have other risk factors for osteoporosis.
So they can help you weigh the risks and benefits and make sure you're doing everything you can to protect your bones.
Exactly. And our sources also mention that some surgical procedures can affect bone health as well.
Okay, so like what kind of procedures?
Well, any surgery that affects your digestive system, things like weight loss surgery or other GI surgeries, they can sometimes interfere with nutrient absorption.
So again, it's that calcium and vitamin D not being properly absorbed.
Right. And over time, that can weaken the bones.
Okay, so as we've seen, there are so many factors that contribute to osteoporosis. It's a really complex puzzle.
It is. And that's why it's so important to have a comprehensive risk assessment. Take all these factors into account, your genetics, your lifestyle, your medical history, your medications, and really get a personalized picture of your bone health.
Yeah, and it sounds like that's where a healthcare professional comes in.
Definitely. They can help you assess your risk, identify any potential problems, and come up with a plan to protect your bones.
Okay, so let's recap here. What are the key takeaways about osteoporosis that we want our listeners to remember?
Okay, so number one, osteoporosis, it's a silent disease.
Mm-hmm.
It often has no symptoms until a fracture occurs.
And those fractures, they can be really serious, leading to chronic pain, disability, loss of independence.
Right, and they can also put a huge strain on our healthcare system.
And remember, we're talking about fragility fractures here, fractures that happen from relatively minor forces.
Exactly, because the bones are weakened.
Now, who's most at risk?
Postmenopausal women and men over 50.
And we talked about all those risk factors, lifestyle, medical conditions, medications.
It's a complex interplay of all those things.
So the bottom line is you really need to be proactive about your bone health.
Absolutely. Talk to your doctor, get a bone density test if needed, and make those lifestyle changes that can help protect your bones for the long haul.
Great advice. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into osteoporosis. We hope you found it informative and helpful.
Yeah, and remember, even if you're not in a high-risk group right now, there are things you can do today to invest in your bone health for the future.
Food for thought. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.